I'm sure at some point, if you've been managing enough people for long enough, or even just been exposed to organizational dynamics, you might have experienced yourself or seen it in somebody else, that when somebody is perhaps in a role that's too advanced for them, it's great to have that fancy title, but often it creates a lot of suffering because they aren't actually prepared to do it, and it's humiliating. And this is what this hyper overly rational orientation does to our minds. That was never its job. And the nice thing is, as much as you might think it might be terrifying, it's not at all, to access the wisdom of our heart, and then to lead with that, step one, and then two, let your mind get to work on how it's going to support you in achieving that. So much better.
You're listening to the Joyous Justice Podcast with award-winning social justice leader and coach, Kohenet April Nichole Baskin. Let's journey into the realms of love and liberation together, dissolving internal barriers and deconstructing systemic oppression from the inside out. Whether you're leading change in an organization or your own life, your next step to advancing joyous justice starts here.
OCO friends, we are back for part 2. So in the latest episode, if you didn't listen to part 1, you will definitely want to do that because you'll be missing some key context. So the prior episode, episode 145, tune in to that episode about reframing and unpacking and explaining some different ways of orienting to transformation. I want to continue this thread and clarify or demystify or unpack. When I said we have a lot of flippin' work to do, we do, but it's not quite as much as people may think. And it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but it's still not as much as people may perceive it to be. In the last episode, I was talking about one key reframe of moving from like hyperlinear A, B, C, D, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, outlining the course of action, that rather than taking that approach, we can use leverage and leveraged priorities and key intervention points that can have disproportionately positive or productively impactful impact than other seemingly similar but not elements or options or tasks or activities that we could be doing. And now in this episode, I want to cover with you, I want to go even deeper into this subject and discuss with you heart and spirit led insight and guidance versus hyper rational domination. We will also be covering the concept of rooted intelligence and why inner transformation matters as a part of this equation. And finally, I want to try on in the episode itself, offering up some reflection questions. We have our standard reflection questions that we include in the show notes of every episode, but I wanted to ask you a few questions here and give you an opportunity in this episode to begin thinking about this throughout your day without having to check the show notes, and then we'll move to close. So let's dive in. I'm very excited to talk about this. So before I dive further into this section, because of the ubiquity and impact of Christian hegemony among some other forms of systemic oppression, many of us have been conditioned with this either or good-bad binary dynamic taking place in our minds, such that when someone like me talks about or champions a particular concept, people often think it's to the exclusion of something else rather than a both and. So I want to be very clear here and clarify from the outset that I am anything but anti-intellectual. This is a both and frame I'm approaching here. As someone who loves learning and strategy and frameworks, wonderful frameworks and discernment. As a number of you may know, I spend a ridiculous amount of time reading, studying, thinking, pontificating, trying to understand how different things work and how they could work better, etc. Last year, I read 101 books, or 101 books to be more precise, and my life was that much better and is that much better for it. I love to read. I'm noticing that I often read, anyway, I'm getting off track. Let's get back on track. But I'll just finish that thought that I often read more in the second half of the year because March through May is typically a difficult time of year for me. So much so that someone floated this idea to me, thanks, Barrett, that I might try of in the future, if I'm doing well enough, of just taking vacation or working fewer hours during that time to just be gentler with myself, especially since I mostly don't mind working during the summer at all. I'm more of an indoor cat anyway. Anyway, back on track. So I'm not anti-intellectual, okay? So this isn't an argument against rationality. I actually really adore rational thinking. It's not that I have any issue at all with rational thinking. In the context of my counter-oppressive healing work, I strive to achieve and help others achieve access to rational thinking in areas where they once had a lot of unhealed harm. And as they steadily heal, they can access clearer thoughts. So wonderful. The argument that I want to make is against or is in opposition to what I think of as hyper rational dominance or supremacy. But I'm just not a big fan of that word because supreme is such a wonderful word. Supreme is what I associate with divinity. And I don't associate systemic oppression, forms of systemic oppression like white domination or an extension of that and settler colonialism as of hyper rational dominance or an extension of that, such as hyper-rational dominance, to be anywhere close to supreme. It's just that it dominates. So let's call it what it is. And by hyper-rational dominance, I mean the hyper-rationality. I mean the belief that the rational mind is the only valid way of knowing, or the highest form of intelligence available to us. That worldview is pervasive and it has a range of consequences. Certainly, it can leave us feeling disconnected and actually, in fact, disconnected from our bodies and intuition, our emotions, our relationships, our interconnection with one another, our imagination, which is the birthplace of innovation and co-creative ideas and just all kinds of good things, and our spirit. And I don't want us to have disconnection from any of those things. I want our work at Joyous Justice and aligned other projects to help people steadily reconnect and reintegrate their capacity to weave and work with all of these parts of their being and all these various sources of knowing. There's a quote often attributed to Einstein that says something along the lines of, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind, its faithful or a faithful servant. And then educator Bob Samples, in his book, The Metaphoric Mind, used that Einstein quote or attribution and took it even further in a way that I truly love, that I learned from one of my most beloved spiritual teachers, Sonia Choquette. As Sonia teaches it, we as human beings are truly, in many aspects of our lives, we're meant to live spirit and heart-led lives. There are whole books about this, about our spirit and particularly our hearts, the form of intelligence that our heart has in being able to navigate and help guide us in our lives. And the spirit, heart, and mind were always meant to work in concert with each other. But that in our contemporary society, most of us have been trained to suppress, to have the mind kind of control and suppress the heart and spirit, rather than the heart and spirit leading and the mind being their faithful servant and helping to figure out the details, but not setting where the GPS is going or determining the North Star, letting our intuitive insight and wisdom and knowing guide that direction, and then using our mind to help us figure out the how. And our mind can be really wonderful at figuring out the how or steps to take, but it's not so great at helping us in making the bravest and most creative choices that we can make in the macro or the micro. Our heart and our spirit are much better equipped to do that work. But unfortunately, so many of us have been taught to live almost entirely from the neck up. And many of us become mind-led in ways that can disconnect us from ourselves and our deeper, more profound spiritual and heart-led experiences. Many of us have become, because of conditioning, to be mind-led in ways that disconnect us from ourselves and our own internal divinity and deeper and higher purpose. Instead, when we are guided by this hyper rationality, neck up, dominant orientation, we frequently, because that is what the mind is prone to, become more fear led while convincing ourselves that we are being rational, as opposed to essentially being oppressed by the limitations of our own mind. And thus, we often end up over intellectualizing decisions that actually require presence and wisdom and intuition, courage, or trust in these kind of big, significant ways. And sometimes, I would contend too often, we mistake constriction for wisdom. But discernment and intuition are obviously quite different, or alternatives to constriction. They're just not the same thing. Wise discernment can help us to perceive clearly. And constriction at times has its place biologically or even in our own minds when we need to make a choice. However, when this pattern is operating chronically, as it often is for many people, it ends up narrowing what people perceive or believe is possible in their life in general and even in the short term. Part of the reason I'm able to facilitate so many amazing, arguably miraculous breakthroughs with my clients is I've found ways to circumvent this constriction. It's not that I don't have just as much conditioning as any of y'all, but I've learned some key strategies that help alleviate the constriction and or just bypass it all together back into expansive, solution-oriented, creative, expansive orientation. And when we are leveraging our heart and our spirit in relatively simple, straightforward ways, we are experiencing a profoundly more expanded experience of choice versus the mind's constrictive, chronic fear pattern. And I think a lot of people have experienced moments where they knew something in their gut or in their heart long before they could explain it logically. This is not rocket science. People talk about, follow your gut at times. This is aligned with what I'm talking about here related to the heart and spirit and accessing the different ways of knowing in our body and through our spirit and intuition. So circling back to Sonia Choquette, talking about this, I'm obviously thinking about her a lot because I really learned this from her now almost 20 years ago to the betterment of my life. I initially began applying the insight I'm going to share with you around like the big decisions in my life about where to live or jobs to go for. And over time, increasingly, I'm doing that thing that people with ADHD where I talk about the thing before I say what it is. I promise I'm about to get to that. And then more recently, increasingly, I'm finding ways of in my micro moments to live a spirit and heart-led life, which honestly, the more I do that, the more I find my and my client's brain relaxes because we've been giving it the wrong job. And if you're a manager or an executive director, I'm sure at some point, if you've been managing enough people for long enough, or even just been exposed to organizational dynamics, even if you haven't been in that leadership or executive leadership role, you might have experienced yourself or seen it in somebody else that when somebody is perhaps in a role that's too advanced for them, like it's great to have that fancy title, but often it creates a lot of suffering because they aren't actually prepared to do it. And it's humiliating. And this is what this hyper overly rational orientation does to our minds. That was never its job. And the nice thing is, as much as you might think it might be terrifying, it's not at all, to access the wisdom of our heart and then to lead with that, step one, and like honor that, like really honor that, and not need to immediately know the how, but just let that sit. And then two, let your mind get to work on how it's going to support you in achieving that. So much better. The mind is in its proper role. And it's not even that it necessarily has to do a linear approach, because often when we start to engage our spirit and our intuition and acknowledge it, it doesn't just stop at times for that initial idea. It continues to flow when it's being honored. And also, if you're into this kind of thing, also the world around us, because our heart and intuition and our spirit account for these variables. So it helps us begin to naturally work in concert with other forces around us, and things can start to flow more smoothly and miraculously in our lives. So back to what I wanted to share about a story about Sonia Choquette. It's one of the practices that I learned from her to engage my heart in guidance is a very simple practice that I'm happy to share with you now. The first time I used this and it worked, funny enough, like kind of surprisingly delightfully well. So I was living in DC at the time, and I was being considered for a wonderful job in Baltimore that I didn't get. And it was one of those annoyingly best case scenarios where I, as a very qualified outsider, didn't get it because one of the alumni of the program decided to apply and was a great candidate and got it. And that's what you want in situations like that. But because of that, and because it was going to be a quick turnaround and a quick startup time with not a lot of transition, I had prepared to move. And after I didn't get the role, I noticed my spirit now was ready to move. As much as I loved DC, I was ready to go somewhere else, but I had no idea where to go. And I was newly acquainted with some of the things Sonia was teaching. And one of the lessons that she teaches is to literally ask your heart. And she recommends to engage with your heart and put your hand on your heart. And you can keep your eyes open or close them if it's helpful to help you focus. And ask the question that you have in your mind's eye or verbally, and then say the words again, verbally or in your mind's eye. My heart says, and I'll try anything just about once, like a number of people. And I wasn't sure if this would work. And I did it. And to my great surprise, a very clear and very unexpected answer came back, which was Boston. And at times when I engage in some of these mystical practices, I wonder, like, is my mind just making this up or something like that? But I knew my mind wasn't making that up, because at that time I'd previously gone to college in Boston, and I felt like the city of Boston hazed me. And it wasn't a fun experience. And as a young woman from Northern California, Boston struck me as very socially, spiritually rough. And I felt like I survived it. And I moved to DC and I loved it there so much. And DC was so much more culturally my speed. And so I knew that my mind didn't say that. Like, I would have never, that wasn't even on the menu of options. But I heard my heart say it very clearly. And as Sonia has taught, not that you need to follow spiritual guidance verbatim, but it's important to honor it. And I thought, like, that is so antithetical to what I would have ever thought. I'm going to do it. And to make a long story short, I moved back to Boston, and it was amazing because Boston had hazed me. But while I was there, I did many different internships and connected with a range of people who remembered and loved me. And also, the last time I'd lived there, I was a college student on scholarship, and I didn't have no money. And so when I moved back to Boston again, I had disposable income. So it became so much more fun and ended up being wonderful. And many wonderful things and blessings flowed from that choice point that led me to where I am now, where I decided to move back to Boston again. And I didn't need to put my hand on my heart that time. I just knew. So what I appreciate about stories like this is that they're often framed as mystical, but there's also an extremely practical lesson. I followed what my heart said. I moved back to Boston. I had a range of very meaningful connections. I'd already been hazed by the city and the culture, so I knew it much better. And because of my sociological training, I'd taken time over the years that I was in college to really learn the different neighborhoods and different communities within Boston, and had an intimacy. And I remember going back to my old college square of Davis Square in Somerville. And before the square was basically CVS and a yarn shop and like maybe one or two other stores, because all the other stores in my mind, and JP Lick's, the ice cream shop, obviously. And other than that everything else was basically blacked out. Now, in real life, they weren't blacked out. But for me, as a college student on scholarship, who had very little to no disposable income outside of necessities, I couldn't access any of that. And so, as I was saying a moment ago, like I was able to go to all these fun places and experience more of the fun of Boston besides just kind of being in the painful experience of getting kicked around a bit or largely being ignored after moving there from California, where people are so lovely and warm and arguably maybe superficial, but are truly kind and without much prompting will often offer to help you, like get things off the shelf at the store or help you figure out what makes sense for you to wear. And Boston just ain't like that. But it did once I understood that culture and it was no longer shocking to my very sensitive system, especially then. Oy. My second time around, I had amazing experiences, had great jobs, and really took the next huge step in my life while living in Boston, which took me to New York City and then from there to Senegal. So there are many other examples I could give of using this principle of experiencing a spirit and heart-led life and using my mind in service of that. And I'm working on a new course and community where some of the other practices related to applying this principle in day-to-day life in wonderfully easeful and delightful ways will be part of that forthcoming course, named to be announced. I mentioned that I'm building out the joyous justice ecosystem, and we're really doing it, and it's very exciting. So more on that to come in the coming weeks and months. So this practice of engaging in spirit and heart-led leadership and then putting our mind back in its appropriate place is, in fact, not airy-fairy or woo-woo, as a number of people would say. I made a social media post about this about a year or so ago about why I no longer use the phrase woo-woo or woo, because it's, to me, in part largely racist. Like, people aren't consciously racist when they say that, to be fair, like, to be very clear here, typically, for the most part. But it comes out of this sexist, racist notion that other ways of knowing, it dismisses indigenous and feminine and maternal, not exclusively, but in terms of patterns and trends, useful but not universal, different ways of knowing that come from the more feminine parts of all of us, as well as indigenous ways of knowing and perceiving and being guided in skillful and exceptionally profound and effective ways. This is simply another form of intelligence. And as you've heard from my own life, some of the most important decisions I've made, and increasingly many micro decisions in my daily life, weren't and aren't purely rational or hyper-rational calculations. And I know in general, people have a sense at times to follow their heart or to listen to their gut, but they often haven't been taught or trained how their heart and their gut or their spirit or intuition can work in collaboration with their mind. And often it ends up kind of being a battle, and they will often defer to their mind, thinking that is the wisest choice, when unfortunately that is often one of the most fear-based and or not even necessarily fear-based, but just limited, constricted avenues for making choices. And part of why I've been able over the past 15 years to help my coaching and consulting clients achieve major feats is because I teach them how to efficiently access these other ways of knowing that help them set not just big goals, because when we're just using our mind, this is about using other forms of knowing that help us detect goals and opportunities that are truly in alignment for us, are meant for us, that account for other variables that our rational mind can't account for, but the realm of the heart and spirit and intuition can and does. So the kinds of goals they set for us are often bold or liberatory. They just involve less compromise and help us go for exciting and purposeful and visionary things that come from within us, but not from the neck down, from other ways of knowing, and to greatly positively consequential effect. Because it involved my clients and I listening to something deeper, not to the exclusion of strategy or discernment, but alongside them, both and. Heart-led decision making isn't the absence of wisdom. Sometimes it's access to a wider field of wisdom than our or the rational mind alone can provide. Because for the most part, it just can't provide that. That was never its job. But in the context of systemic oppression, we've been spreading it thin and having it run amok and do all kinds of things that it wasn't designed to do. So why is it that so many of us have been so susceptible to this oppressive conditioning? I was recently on a call with one of my beloved friend tours, Sherry Brown, and she said something that is so relevant for this episode that I want to say here. In that instance, she was talking about Jews. And for me, as an indigenous woman who is Jewish and has both indigenous heritage from Africa and Turtle Island, this quote is applicable for every part of those different facets of my identity. She said, quote, "Many of us have been robbed of our roots." And when I think about colonialism, capitalism, racialized capitalism, what I often call hyper-rational dominance, that's one of the things that I see happening over and over again. People become disconnected and have been conditioned to be profoundly disconnected from a whole host of elements of their living, which is why I'm interested in talking about rehumanization, because we fundamentally, naturally, as humans, have connections to all of these different things. And what are these things? These things are our bodies, our intuition, disconnection from our lineages and heritages and histories, our emotions, from our connection to spirit, access to robust elements of our imagination, from our own humanity. And when this happens, and because so many of us have been conditioned in this manner, due to all of this immense and chronic disconnection, we've often been conditioned to chronically move through the world as if the only valid forms of knowing are the ones we can measure, quantify, prove, or explain. When I say that, it reminds me of one of my favorite lessons or talks that Professor Joy DeGruy gave, where she was like, with Europeans, if you can't measure it, it's not real. You got to be able to quantify and measure it. But human beings for thousands of years have always known in more ways than just this hyper rationality. And one of the things I want to be very clear about here is that every human being has rooted histories. Even people who think that they don't or have been permanently disconnected. And there's lots of people, which this is a whole separate conversation, who think they're disconnected. I was just on a call with an amazing leader the other day who helps guide people through this. And she herself thought that there was irreparable harm done, and recently had a chance to go to Europe and found her people. Not always, but often this is the case. But regardless, many of us have experienced some degree to profound degrees of disconnection. But the thing is, even if we don't know it in our minds, those connections, those roots are still there regardless. They are right there for us when we are ready to pursue them with informed resource and loving support. It's possible for us in various ways to begin to reconnect with our ancestral and spiritual inheritances in ways that perhaps a number of us thought wasn't possible. This is part of the work the admittedly somewhat harrowing, but holy work I've been doing over the past several years. What I'm talking about here isn't elite spiritualism, nor is it niche mysticism. This is part of what it means to be human and to steadily, with whatever pacing makes sense for you, to reclaim more parts of being human, to reclaim more of the fullness of our humanity. We all come from somewhere. And all of those somewheres gave us an inheritance that we carry, whether we know it or not, of stories, experiences, wisdom, adaptations, and inheritances sacred, culturally rich and deep inheritances that existed long before we arrive and that we still have access to. I love the reframe of AI and artificial intelligence that I once heard Reverend Stephen Lewis talk about as ancestral intelligence. Ooh, I love that. And obviously, although this can be true, actually, it's not necessarily ancestors whispering instructions into your ear or mine, although at times my ancestors have delivered messages to me that felt almost like they were whispering in my ear, though some people experience things that way. But rather, the recognition that there is wisdom available to us through our histories, our lineages, our intuitive nudges, things that we've just known before we were born that often perhaps we've been conditioned to discount, but it's been right there. And often it's still there if we just dust it off in our mind and spirit. It's in our communities and our cultures. It's frequently in various ways that we move and speak and live, the way we embody culture, and the countless people whose lives made our lives possible in the ways that feel safe and resourced and make sense for each one of us as it makes sense. We get to contradict this chronic uprootedness and reconnect with our roots, because rooted intelligence has profound capacity to help us anchor into deep wells of power and recognize possibilities and leverage points we might otherwise miss. So, bridging into the next and final layer of this conversation, I want to talk about conditioning a little bit more than I already have, because before we can understand why transformation sometimes feels so difficult or why certain possibilities seem out of reach, we have to understand that most of us are not perceiving reality from the neutral place that we've been conditioned to believe, or perhaps that we know we're not perceiving from, but still by default, because of our conditioning, even if part of our brain, a part of us knows it's not neutral, we still ultimately perceive it as neutral, if that makes sense. We're always perceiving things through layers of conditioning. Conditioning shapes what we notice and what we ignore. It shapes what we believe is possible and what we dismiss before we ever seriously consider it. In addition to that, it also often shapes what feels reasonable, realistic, possible, and or true. And most often, we don't even realize it's happening. We assume or just think we're simply seeing reality as it is, when in fact we're seeing reality through a lens we've inherited from our families, cultures, institutions, our identities, our experiences, and the systems we've been taught to navigate, as well as with the inherent bias that we often treat reality as though it is fixed, when all reality is a consequence of past actions. And if we begin to vision out and follow our spirit and heart-led guidance and use the creative power of our imagination, and then have our mind, give it a day or two, begin to work in service of that, what happens is we can start to take actions that begin to co-create what will become our reality in the future. Reality is not fixed. It's just a consequence of past actions. So people think of it like it's this locked in thing instead of noticing that collectively we could all get resourced and choose to make, or not even all of us, but a key percentages of us and key leveraged points throughout society in different ways, and make different choices that lead to different outcomes that give us a radically and or significantly improved reality from the one we have now. But instead, people think essentially some variation of this is always how it's going to be. Also, change eventually comes, as opposed to noticing that with effective resourcing and the inner work we can do to steel ourselves and help us access the full power that we have as adults, that we have the immense capacity to affect and co-create massive positive change. And so if we're going to talk about massive transformation being more within reach than we've been taught to believe, we also have to talk about the ways we've been taught to believe that in the first place. for all the different reasons that we know. Our oppressive conditioning shapes even our sense of what our neutral perception is. That is heavily shaped by this conditioning, and what we pursue and what we're willing to tolerate, what gets normalized, and what we give ourselves the leeway to even imagine. People think they're seeing reality clearly when they're actually seeing through their conditioning. And I mean both the actual circumstances and also whether or not they can affect change within those circumstances as a part of that reality. And this is, as I just said, to reiterate, I'm looping a little bit, so hopefully that's helpful. This is why doing the inner work is so important, to help clarify our vision and perception. Not instead of systems change, but because by doing that inner work, especially from a liberatory, counter-oppressive lens, we are able to have a much more visionary and courageous sense of what's possible, and also have a bold and more effective ability to perceive where are our greatest leveraged intervention points as a part of systems change, as a way to strengthen and elevate systems change. So with that, let's get into some reflection questions. I hope you've been enjoying this episode. Where in your life are you assuming force is required when discernment and attunement might actually be what's needed? And by that, I mean discernment and attunement of your attention, like attentional discernment and attunement that helps you figure out key leverage points or shift out of hyperrationality and into spirit and heart-led decision-making and guidance. Next question. Question number 2. And the idea here is that you can choose 1 to 3 to focus on, to think about, to perhaps journal about, or do some audio dictation on your phone. You could pause it right now as you're listening and do it, or listen to all of these. And then afterward, do some writing or find a song that feels resonant for you and dance through it in relationship with 1 or more of these questions. In terms of your own personal experience, what rooted forms of knowing might be asking for your attention? And the third and final question, when has one conversation, insight, boundary, or act of courage changed far more downstream than you initially realized, or perhaps more so than others perceived that it might? Thanks for staying in this with me throughout this whole episode. Let's move into the close for now. Massive transformation may be far more within reach than you've been taught to believe. I hope that's a clear takeaway you've gotten. Not because the work is small or less than we thought, but because leverage exists, as does discernment, rooted intelligence, and strategic interventions. Also, spirit and heart-led wisdom is right there and ready for us. You can put your hand on your heart and say, my heart says. In the future, you could also join some of my forthcoming courses and membership and learn other ways of easily and intuitively accessing this profound source of knowing. And what are some other key points here that have been in this episode? Human beings are far more capable than we've been conditioned to believe or understand them to be. And there is far more that is possible here in this moment, in the coming days, months, in this right now, than we were taught to know or imagine. And so in light of all of this that we've covered in part 1 and part 2 of this episode, I want to offer this blessing to you. May you remember that you do not have to carry everything all at once. May intuition and leveraged prioritization deepen where overwhelm and over-intellectualization once lived. May you increasingly recognize openings, relationships, wisdom, and leverage points available to you. And may you grow in your capacity to move through this world with increasing connection to your kishkas, your heart's wisdom, your spirit's wisdom, and other forms of intuitive knowing. Wishing you many blessings, and until the next episode, much love.
Thanks for tuning in. To learn more about Joyous Justice LLC, and how you can work with April, check out the info in the show notes or visit joyousjustice.com. If you enjoyed this episode, show some love. Subscribe or leave a comment wherever you're listening. Tell your people, share what you're learning, stay humble but not too humble, and keep going, because the future is ours to co-create.